The lights in the flagship restaurant glimmered, reflecting off the luxurious dinnerware, the pristine white porcelain plates, and the crystal-clear wine glasses as if they were filtering each ray of light. This restaurant was a symbol of success, a mini-city for those seeking perfection. And here James, the founder and owner of the renowned restaurant chain, sat alone in the corner of the dining room, staring at a cold, forgotten cup of coffee. At this moment, coffee was no longer a pleasure or a habit, but merely an inanimate object, offering nothing to excite James. James had built his empire from humble beginnings in a cramped kitchen, where the smell of grease and fatigue were constant companions. Now he owned 12 restaurants, each a masterpiece, a tribute to his achievements. The city spoke his name with respect, but that call echoed hollowly in his heart. He should have been happy. He had achieved everything he wanted: wealth, fame, power. But what he had received in return was loneliness, an emptiness between leather chairs, glossy lacquered tables, and expensive artwork. Everything in this restaurant gleamed, but he could not find a single ray of light for himself. And that was when Altha entered. The small girl, just a part of the service team, but an indispensable element in the colorful picture. Altha moved between the tables like a silent ghost, as though she didn't belong here. She carried not only food and drinks, but also secrets and pains that no one knew. The entire restaurant saw a dedicated server, but few noticed that she was fighting a battle much larger than anyone could imagine. When Altha bent down to pick up the scattered crayons on the floor, her limp leg was visible, but she didn't let anyone see her weakness. A white bandage peeked out from under her worn-out black shoe, but her smile remained bright, as though nothing could bring her down. Everyone kept laughing, eating, and talking, no one paying attention to the girl silently battling herself, except for James. James, with his sharp eyes, noticed the details everyone else missed. This waitress wasn't just working, she was carrying unseen wounds, pain that she bore every day. And in that moment, he couldn't help but feel the injustice, the divide between his luxurious life and the people like Altha who worked tirelessly. He remembered his own days when he too worked hard, tired feet, hands covered in scars, but the hope always burned brightly in his heart. Now, looking at this girl, James couldn't help but wonder, do people like Altha ever get the attention they truly deserve? Was he seeing a victor amidst the storm of life? And that was why he was here today, not as a boss, but as an anonymous diner, silently observing everything happening. James realized that he had lost connection with the people he had built his empire for. The numbers on paper had replaced real people. He could no longer live in a world filled only with numbers and accomplishments. He wanted to feel the rhythm of real life again, no matter how painful it might be. The golden light in the restaurant created a luxurious atmosphere, but to James, everything seemed dull and cold. He watched Altha from the corner, where no one noticed him. The small girl moved skillfully between the tables, her delicate hands carrying invisible burdens. Each step she took made James more acutely aware of the exhaustion she couldn't hide. Only the light from the chandelier helped him see her frailness as she tried to conceal the pain in every step. The customers around the table didn't notice this. They only saw a cute waitress smiling gracefully, handing out menus and bringing food. But James saw something different. Behind Altha's bright smile was a woman constantly battling, not just with her job, but with herself. She was like a silent soldier, enduring and serving without asking for anything in return. And when she bent down, her back slightly hunched from exhaustion, reaching to pick up the scattered crayons, James' heart clenched. Every step Altha took was a sacrifice. Her worn shoes were tattered, but she still tried to move quickly, not letting the customers wait too long. James noticed the white bandage on her foot, a clear sign of an injury, but it didn't slow her down. She just kept going, keeping up the smile, as if the only pain was the exhaustion from her work. James couldn't help but feel the injustice between his life and the lives of people like Altha. He was the owner of this renowned chain of restaurants, a business he had spent years building. But what he saw around him, was all superficial. The restaurant, the staff, the customers, all part of the game he had created. But in this glittering picture, there was something missing, something that couldn't be measured by numbers or accomplishments. "Spreadsheets don't bleed," he whispered to himself. He had overlooked the small but incredibly important details in his work. The numbers he counted every day never told him the stories of the people working here. They endure, they sacrifice, but he only saw the profit growth reports. And then, as the light from the chandelier illuminated Altha in the room, her smile on her face like a mask, a cover she had to wear to cope with the world outside, James realized the truth he could no longer deny. He, over all these years, had built an empire in which people like Altha were merely tools to serve his success. Thinking about this, James couldn't help but feel a pang of sorrow. He had everything he wanted, but he had lost the most important thing: genuine connection with the people he had unknowingly pushed away. The people who worked tirelessly to maintain this empire, but no one saw them. Not even him, the owner of the empire, ever noticed them. That realization awakened him. Numbers could never replace people. And when he looked at Altha, he saw clearly that the success he had built was just a solid wall that covered up the pain and sacrifice he had ignored. James decided he could no longer sit here and continue being an observer. He wanted to change something. But how to begin? The soft breeze from the window couldn't ease the weight in James's mind. He remained seated in the corner of the restaurant, observing Altha's every movement as though she were part of a vibrant painting he was trying to decode. Despite the bustling dining room filled with laughter, clinking silverware, and chatter from one table to the next, all James could think about was one question that kept echoing in his mind. Why didn't I see this before? He watched Altha as she smiled at customers, gently carrying plates of food, but when no one was looking, every step she took seemed like a struggle against pain. Her limping steps, her face occasionally tight with tension, only to be replaced by a bright smile. All of it was a mask, a facade hiding the exhaustion she was silently enduring. James realized that every single moment, every step Altha took was a battle, and she couldn't win that battle alone. Without thinking, James's mind returned to his past, to the days when he too struggled in the kitchen, scrubbing dishes in a cramped, greasy space, surrounded by the smell of oil and dust, with no light at the end of the tunnel. He had once been a part of the team, washing dishes, cleaning, just like Altha, and every night he would drag himself home, exhausted without ever complaining. His shoes were worn out, his hands burned and calloused, and the fatigue was almost unbearable. But when he looked at Altha, he realized that she wasn't just a server. She was a warrior, fighting silently in a battle no one could see. He had once been like that, but now he had stepped out of that darkness, built his empire, and everything had changed. But there was one thing he couldn't change: how he had unknowingly forgotten about people like Altha. He had seen the exhaustion in her eyes, but he chose to ignore it. He had noticed the worn shoes and the bandage on her foot, but he never asked if she needed help. He had seen it all, but he hadn't cared. The truth was, throughout the years of success, James had overlooked people like Altha. They were the ones who held his empire together, but they were merely shadows in the financial reports, faceless numbers. James had lived in a glittering shell, a life full of material success, but it lacked the one thing he truly needed: real connections with the people around him. His mind came back to that question: what have I built? Success? Or just an empty gaze at lifeless numbers? James realized that while he had built his empire, people like Altha were silently sacrificing, carrying burdens he had never noticed. Looking at her, he felt a pain he couldn't shake. Altha wasn't just working for money. She wasn't just doing a job to survive. She was working for something deeper, something James hadn't understood until now. It was love. Love for her family, for her loved ones, for dreams not yet realized. James closed his eyes, imagining how much Altha must have sacrificed to ensure her loved ones could have a better life. Every drop of sweat, every painful step, all for someone she loved. In that moment, he realized that his success meant nothing without people like her. People he had forgotten about while chasing his career. He could no longer keep watching these pains without doing something. James felt a fierce determination rise in him. He had to act. He couldn't continue to be just an observer in his own empire. He had to stand up. He had to do something. The entire atmosphere of the restaurant seemed to shrink. The pale yellow light illuminated every corner, reflecting off the luxurious tables, the shiny plates. But that light now only highlighted the emptiness in James's heart. He looked around and realized that no matter how beautiful everything was, it couldn't hide the absence of true values. People like Altha, those who worked tirelessly day and night, were carrying the weight of an entire world, yet were never truly seen or appreciated. James felt a restlessness inside him, a feeling that something that had been suppressed for years was now rising to the surface. He could no longer turn a blind eye. The numbers, the financial reports, the revenue achievements, he had enough of those. It was time for him to see the real people, to stop being a boss in expensive suits and become someone who genuinely cares, someone who can feel what really matters. We don't live to just accumulate money and power. The words echoed in his mind, a reminder of why he had started this journey in the first place. He remembered himself, back when he was struggling in the kitchen, with hands soiled from grease, working endlessly just to make ends meet. Everything had changed since then, but he felt as though he had lost something important in the process. He had forgotten that people, real people, were the most valuable asset. James couldn't just stand by and watch people like Altha bear the weight alone anymore. Though he had built a chain of upscale restaurants with shiny tables and grand parties, he now realized that it was the people who served behind the scenes, silently working hard, who were the true pillars of his success. They gave life to everything around him, but they were never acknowledged. He made up his mind. He could no longer stay seated in this corner, distanced from the people he had built this empire for. He had to take action. It was time to make a change, not just in the way the company operated, but in the very essence of how he viewed the people around him. He knew it wouldn't be easy, but it was the right thing to do. He stood up, his resolve clear in his heart. James knew that for any real change to happen, he would need to start by showing respect, understanding, and care for those who had been overlooked for so long. The time had come to act, and he would no longer be a passive observer in his own empire. He had to be the one who led this transformation, not just in business, but in the lives of those who had helped him build it. James took a deep breath and walked toward the kitchen, where Altha was busy at work. Today, he would make sure she knew her sacrifice hadn't gone unnoticed. He would make sure she and everyone like her would no longer be invisible. It was time to start the change, and he was going to lead it, step by step. The silence in the restaurant was no longer just the clinking of glasses or the laughter of the guests. It was the quiet that James felt most deeply in his life. He stood in the middle of the room, his heart pounding as though each beat was calling for a profound change. Every step Altha took, every smile she forced, hit James's conscience, reminding him that he could no longer live in the shell of success without seeing what was really going on inside. We don't live just to accumulate money and power. That self-reminder echoed in his mind, a wake-up call, urging him to reconnect with why he started this journey in the first place. He remembered his own past, the days when he struggled in the kitchen, his hands stained with grease, and no light at the end of the tunnel. Everything had changed now, but he realized he had lost an important part of the journey. He had forgotten that the most valuable thing was people. James could no longer stand by and watch people like Altha carry the weight on their own. Despite owning luxurious restaurants with gleaming tables and grand parties, he now understood that the true strength of his success lay in the people working behind the scenes, silently enduring to keep everything afloat. They brought life to the whole operation, but never got the recognition they deserved. He made a firm decision. He could no longer remain in the background, observing from a distance. He needed to take action. It was time to see the people around him, not as workers or numbers, but as human beings whose struggles and sacrifices had been hidden from his view for too long. He knew that change wouldn't come easily, but it was time to do the right thing. He muttered to himself, "It's time for a real change." He knew that for anything substantial to happen, he needed to start by seeing and respecting the people who had built this empire with him. James took a deep breath and made his way to the kitchen, where Altha was working. He realized that today he would ensure she knew that her sacrifices hadn't gone unnoticed. It was time to make the change. He would lead it, step by step, starting with Altha and extending to every person who had silently worked to build the empire. James could not delay any longer. The decisions he made today weren't just about improving working conditions for one person. They were about redefining the empire he had built. He understood that he couldn't change everything overnight, but without starting with the smallest changes, the bigger ones would never happen. The next day, James decided to implement changes immediately. He sat down with Corwin, the managers, and even with Altha. An emergency meeting was held to discuss all the issues that up until then he had never truly seen. We need to make this job an experience that respects the people, not a burden. James started the meeting with strong words, inspiring everyone in the room. People won't have to work to the point where their bodies can't take it anymore. We will create an environment where every employee is respected, cared for, and doesn't have to sacrifice their health or happiness just to keep the restaurant running. Altha sat in the corner of the room, not speaking, but her eyes were full of surprise. She had never imagined that one day, the owner of the restaurant would treat her and the other workers as real people. They were no longer just tools, invisible figures moving through the restaurant each day. James continued with specific plans. He asked Corwin to create a more flexible work schedule so that every employee could get proper rest without affecting the overall operation. We'll reduce unnecessary overtime and make sure no one works past their limits. Every employee needs to have enough time to rest, he added. The room fell silent. James's proposals were entirely different from how things had been done before. They were used to pushing employees beyond their limits, and now easing the burden on them seemed like a bold idea. But James wasn't concerned about being bold. He was concerned about doing what was right. A week after the meeting, things began to change. The small adjustments in the work schedule helped the employees feel less stressed. Meetings no longer dragged on from morning to night, and days off were no longer ignored. From then on, they heard words of appreciation, the owner's care for them, not just a casual wave. But what was more important was the change in James himself. He had started seeing his employees not just as parts of a machine, but as real human beings, with emotions, families, personal stories. He began caring for them more, not just about their work, but about their lives. Altha felt this change, though she still maintained her usual bright smile. She no longer had to carry the burden of her work in silence, nor hide the pain in her tired legs. James's support had made her feel valued, and above all, it made her realize that her sacrifices were not in vain. James saw the change in Altha, and he knew he had done the right thing. He had not only changed the way the company operated, but also changed the lives of those who had helped him build it from the ground up. One evening, after the restaurant had emptied out, James stopped by Altha as she was finishing up for the day. "You don't have to do it all by yourself anymore. We will make things easier for you," he said, gently placing a hand on her shoulder. Altha looked at him, her eyes wide with emotion. "Thank you, James," she said, her voice soft but full of gratitude. James smiled, feeling a sense of relief. He knew that the small changes were starting to have an effect. And although it was just a small step, he understood that this was the beginning of a long journey, not only for the company, but for how he would view life, work, and the people who made it all possible. That night, as he sat alone in his office, he finally felt that his company was no longer just an empire of money, but a family, a place where every person was valued, respected, and loved. The next day, James woke up with a fresh sense of clarity. His determination wasn't just a small revolution within his company. It was a profound awakening about his role in the lives of those around him. He knew that to truly change, it wasn't enough to make small adjustments. He needed to change how he viewed things, not just Altha, but everyone who had contributed to building his empire. James decided to step out of his comfort zone, not only at work, but also in his personal relationships. He started actively communicating more with his employees, not just about work, but about their personal lives. He listened to their stories, the struggles, hopes, and dreams they had never shared before. He was no longer a supervisor from a distance, but a companion who walked alongside them, helping them face the challenges of everyday life. One of the most important decisions James made was to establish a support fund for his employees. He wanted to ensure that none of them would have to sacrifice their health or happiness for their jobs. The fund would provide financial support for those facing difficulties, not only for health reasons, but also for other emergencies. This was his way of showing employees that they weren't working for something intangible. They were working for a cause that mattered, to build a better life for themselves and their loved ones. The process wasn't easy, Not all employees were quick to accept these changes. Some felt uncomfortable because they had grown accustomed to working in silence, never asking for help. But slowly, employees like Altha, those who had been silently sacrificing, began to realize that this change was not only good for them, but for everyone in the company. James didn't just make organizational changes. He extended a human invitation to all his employees. He wanted to build a company culture where everyone was appreciated, cared for, and didn't have to feel like they had to hide their personal struggles. He didn't want anyone to have to fight alone anymore. Gradually, this new culture began to take shape in the atmosphere of the restaurant. Employees no longer felt like they were working in a cold, uncaring environment. They began supporting each other, not only in their tasks but also in tough times. And each person realized that the strength of the team didn't just lie in their ability to work, but in their unity and care for one another. Altha, though still maintaining her usual bright smile, could feel the difference in the work environment. She no longer had to carry the burden of her work in silence, nor hide the pain in her tired legs. James's support had helped her feel valued, and most importantly, it made her realize that her sacrifices weren't in vain. James saw this change in Altha, and he knew he had done the right thing. He had not only changed the way the company operated, but had changed the lives of those who helped him build it from the ground up. One day, as the restaurant was winding down, James saw Altha standing by a table, smiling and chatting with the customers, balancing the trays lightly. This time, there was no hidden pain behind that smile. She looked up, caught James's gaze, and smiled, a smile that wasn't forced or concealing any suffering, but one filled with gratitude and pride. For James, this wasn't just a change in the company. It was a journey that made him realize that true success wasn't about owning buildings or luxury cars, but about the connections and care he could offer to the people who helped build everything. The road ahead was still long, but James knew that he had already done something important. He was no longer just the founder of an empire. He had become a leader, someone who ensured fairness, someone that all his employees could look at and say, "We don't just work to live, we live to work with meaning." The brightest stars aren't always those that are visible. Sometimes they come from the small, relentless efforts of people like Altha. The next day, James couldn't stop thinking about everything he had witnessed. Altha's story, the small but resilient woman, had completely changed the way he saw his company and the people working in it. He realized that every success of his, every shiny building, every breakthrough business strategy that he thought was his own achievement, was valuable because of people like Altha. They were the ones who silently sacrificed, accepted to bear everything in silence so his company could exist and grow. With these thoughts in mind, James started planning his next steps. He didn't just want to change the work environment. He wanted to transform the company into a place where every employee felt important and valued. He decided to start with small but meaningful changes that could make a big difference in the lives of those who had sacrificed so much for the company without asking for anything in return. James planned to organize regular meetings between the management team and employees to truly understand the challenges they were facing. The questions wouldn't just focus on work performance anymore, but would delve into their health, safety, and personal happiness. He wanted them to realize that they were not just working machines but real people, each with their own stories, dreams, and aspirations, often overshadowed by the pressures of work. Gradually, a new culture began to take shape in James's company. He organized classes on life skills, stress management, and mental health care. He invited nutritionists, fitness experts, and psychologists to advise employees on how to maintain a balance between work and life. Because James understood that without good health, without happiness, all the success in the world would mean nothing. But the most important thing James did wasn't just to improve the working conditions. He started acting like a true leader, not from the top, but as part of the team, sharing the burdens with them. He committed to being the one leading the change, always ready to face mistakes and learn from those around him. With these decisions, not only did the work environment change, but the attitude and spirit of the employees shifted as well. They no longer felt like they were just parts of the company machine, but like important contributors to its true value. Altha, after enduring years of silence, was now able to take pride in her work without hiding her pain or fatigue. She no longer had to live in secrecy. James's support helped her feel valued, and above all, it made her realize that her sacrifices were not in vain. One evening, When the company held an event to celebrate the year's achievements, James stood on stage, looking out at the employees who were applauding. He felt an unusual joy, a happiness he had never experienced from external victories. This was his greatest victory, the victory of gratitude, change, and love in the workplace. Certainly, the road ahead would still be long, but James knew he had done something important. He was no longer just the founder of an empire. He had become a leader, a protector of fairness, someone all his employees could look at and say, "We don't just work to live, we live to work with meaning." The brightest stars aren't always the visible ones. Sometimes the brightest stars come from the small, relentless efforts of people like Alpha. Thank you for following this story with us. If you found this video inspiring or it helped you see life in a new light, don't forget to leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments below. We'd love to hear your feedback. And if you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, be sure to hit subscribe so you don't miss any exciting and meaningful videos in the future. Thank you again, and we'll see you in the next videos. Wishing you strength and confidence on your journey.